In September of 1971, the soil of Finney County, Kansas smelled the way it always did before it gave up. Dry chalk and cracked clay, the particular dustiness of a field that had sweated out its last moisture and was now simply waiting. Roy Callahan stood at the north edge of his 480 acres at 6:30 in the morning, the air still cool enough to see his breath, and pressed the back of his right hand flat against the cracked surface of the ground. He held it there for a moment, reading something the soil said only through pressure and temperature. Then he straightened, dusted his knuckles against his denim jacket, and walked back toward the red Farmall 560, idling at the fence line. Roy was 58 years old. He had farmed this same ground for 34 years, since his father handed him the deed in 1937 at a kitchen table in Garden City. He knew Finney County the way a man knows a body he has lived inside. Its low spots where moisture gathered, its sandy north quarter where water fled, its clay hardpan that sat 18 inches down and either saved a crop or killed it, depending on which side of a dry June you stood. He had survived 3 bad droughts, 2 price collapses, and 1 hailstorm in 1958 that stripped 200 acres of wheat down to bare stalks in 11 minutes. He had not complained about any of them in a way that required a second sentence. What Roy stood to lose that September was specific. Garden City Federal Savings held a note for $1,400 against his equipment and a portion of his north acreage, signed in March of 1970, when his 1963 John Deere 95 combine needed a new cylinder drum and a rebuilt auger. The note came due in October of 1974, 3 years away. He had calculated, on a yellow legal pad stored in the drawer beneath his father's field notebooks, that he needed 18 bushels per acre across his 310 planted acres to clear that note and keep his input costs covered. The county average the past 4 years had been 22. It seemed manageable. Then, on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September 1971, a truck from the Kansas State University Cooperative Extension Service pulled up Roy's gravel drive. If this kind of story is what you came here for, subscribe, there are more of them. The extension agent's name was Dennis Croft. He was 31 years old, held a master's degree in agronomy from Manhattan, and wore a pressed khaki shirt with the KSU seal embroidered on the breast pocket. He carried a clipboard. He had been assigned to survey the county's experimental plantings ahead of the 1972 growing season, and Roy's 12-acre test plot, visible from the county road, had flagged in his paperwork as an unauthorized hybrid trial. Roy had planted that test plot in spring of 1971. It did not look like the plots on either side of it. The rows were narrower, 7 inches apart instead of the standard 10. The stalks were shorter and thicker stemmed than certified hard red winter wheat, with a leaf architecture that sat lower to the ground, closer to sorghum than to wheat. Roy had labeled the rows in his notebook with a code only he read. He had not filed a report with the Extension Office because he had not used their seed, their program, or their money. Croft walked the test plot for 9 minutes. He made notes. Then he stood at the field edge across from Roy and said, "This doesn't meet the certified variety requirements for the county dryland program." Roy said, "I'm not in the county dryland program." Croft looked at his clipboard. He said, "You're aware that uncertified hybrid trials can impact neighboring fields through cross-contamination." Roy said, "My fields don't have neighbors within a quarter mile on 3 sides." Croft made another note. He told Roy that the Extension Office would be monitoring the plot and that he should expect a follow-up communication regarding compliance. Then he drove away. 3 weeks later, Roy walked into Harlan Meese's feed store in Garden City to buy a sack of trace mineral supplement. Harlan Meese had run that store for 22 years. He knew every farmer in the county by first name, knew their debts and their yields and their feuds, and he considered himself a clearinghouse for practical agricultural knowledge. Dennis Croft had visited the store 2 days before Roy arrived. Harlan said, in front of 2 other men buying fence staples, "Roy, I heard your experiment plot is going to get flagged. Extension says you're growing something that isn't registered anywhere." Roy set the mineral supplement bag on the counter and said, "How much?" Harlan said, $7.40. "Roy, I'm serious. Croft told me those stalks don't look like wheat or sorghum. Said it looked like something that wouldn't survive a real drought anyway. Said, and I'm quoting him here, whatever Callahan thinks he's bred, he's 30 years too late, and a university too short." The 2 men at the fence staples said nothing, but they were listening. Roy paid in cash, picked up the bag, and walked out. He had no formal legal recourse against the extension's characterization of his plot. They had broken no law. They had simply told the county feed store owner, in plain language, that Roy Callahan's private seed experiment was agronomically worthless. In Finney County in 1971, that was as effective as a published report. Roy's father, Walter Callahan, had farmed the same 480 acres from 1913 to 1956, and he had kept notebooks. Not the kind of notebooks the Extension Service issued. Those were thin stapled pamphlets with pre-printed columns for planting dates and fertilizer application rates. Walter's notebooks were bound in oilcloth, filled with his cramped pencil handwriting, and covered every growing season from 1921 onward. By 1971, there were 19 of them, stored in a flat wooden box under Roy's bed. Walter had been a careful observer of the 1930s drought years, not as a victim, but as a recorder. During the summer of 1936, when the county lost nearly its entire wheat crop to heat and dry wind, Walter had written 11 pages about a section of his south field where the wheat, crossed accidentally with a volunteer sorghum plant, had survived into late July, while everything around it died. He had noted the depth of the root system when he pulled a plant. The seminal roots reached 29 inches into the subsoil, 4 to 6 inches deeper than the pure wheat beside it. He had written, in his direct way, "Plant reached the wet." Others did not, worth understanding. Walter had spent the next 4 growing seasons attempting to reproduce the cross deliberately. He documented the narrow window for controlled pollination, 6 days in late June when both plants flowered, and the technique for cold stratifying the resulting seed at 38 degrees Fahrenheit for 21 days before autumn planting. The cold treatment mimicked a hard freeze and triggered a germination response that, Walter found, produced a root system 30% more aggressive in sandy soils than untreated seed. The Extension Service in Walter's time had not been interested. Their job was to distribute certified seed varieties from state-approved programs, and a farmer's notebook experiment, however precise, was not certifiable. Walter had understood this without bitterness and continued his own work for 12 more years, refining the cross and the cold treatment until his death in 1956. Roy had read every page of every notebook. He had not acted on them until 1969, when a dry spring killed 14 acres of his certified wheat. On the north sandy field, and he stood in the dead rows with his hat in his hands and thought about his father's 11 pages. The extension's dismissal, Roy understood now, had one practical consequence they had not intended. It freed him from their seed purchasing mandates. He had no obligation to their certified varieties. He could plant whatever he chose on his own acreage. They had, by trying to constrain him, removed the one institutional check that might have slowed him down. He did not share this thought with anyone. In October of 1971, Roy harvested his 12-acre test plot with the 1963 John Deere 95 combine, green body and yellow trim, its cylinder drum rebuilt 2 years before and running smooth. The plot yielded 17 bushels per acre, below standard, which he had expected, because the hybrid cross needed another generation of selection before the yield characteristics stabilized. That was not the point of this year. The point was the root depth. He pulled 20 plants from various sections of the plot and measured the seminal root length with a steel rule on his workbench. The shortest was 26 inches. The longest was 33 inches. The average was 29.4 inches. His father's notebook from 1936 recorded 29 inches as the measurement that had kept one plant alive while its neighbors died. Roy wrote the number in his own notebook beneath a copy of his father's entry and set both books back under the wooden box. That winter, January and February of 1972, Roy ran his cold stratification process in the root cellar beneath the farmhouse. The cellar held a consistent temperature of 36 to 39 degrees Fahrenheit through the winter months. He spread the harvested hybrid seed in flat wooden trays on the cellar shelves and left them for 21 days, checking the temperature with a mercury thermometer twice daily and recording the readings in a logbook that also tracked the maintenance schedule for the 1941 seed drill, his father's instrument, with its brass fittings and its wooden seed box refinished twice since Walter built it. In spring of 1972, Roy planted 62 acres of the cold stratified hybrid seed, using that drill, pulled behind the red Farmall 560 diesel, at 3 miles per hour across the prepared ground. The drill's brass disc openers, cutting rows at exactly 7-inch spacing. The drill had been built to Roy's father's specification, with an adjustable seed plate setting that the extension's commercial equipment could not replicate. At 7-inch spacing, the plant canopy closed faster in dry conditions, shading the soil surface and reducing moisture loss. Walter's notebook, entry dated June 1944, contained the calculation. In late March, Harlan Meese stopped Roy outside the co-op elevator and said, "I heard you planted that same hybrid mess again. People are saying you're throwing money at something that isn't real." Roy looked at him. He said, "People buy a lot of certified seed." Harlan said, "That's because it works." Roy nodded once and walked to his truck. The 62 acres grew through May and June. Roy checked the soil moisture by hand every 4 days, pressing a steel probe 30 inches into the ground and examining the tip. The subsoil moisture at 28 to 32 inches held in his hybrid section 3 weeks longer than in the neighboring certified wheat field on his south acreage. He wrote the dates and readings in the logbook without comment. In July of 1972, Roy received a phone call from his brother-in-law, Gerald Fitch, who farmed 300 acres of certified wheat in neighboring Gray County. Gerald had heard through his wife, Roy's sister Mabel, that Roy was running some kind of private seed experiment and had skipped the county program. Gerald said, "Roy, if the extension doesn't back it and it fails in a dry year, you're going to lose that north field. That's not worth it." Roy said. "I appreciate the call." He set the receiver down. That August was dry. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the kind of dry that pruned weak stands down to their essentials. Roy drove the fence line of his 62-acre hybrid plot on the morning of August 22nd, the air already at 94 degrees by 8 o'clock, and looked at the field. The plants had not reached full height. They topped out at 28 inches, 8 inches shorter than the certified wheat on his south acreage. But they were green. The tassels stood erect. In the certified field to the south, the flag leaves had begun to roll, the plant's last defense against dehydration, and the color had shifted from deep green to a yellowish sage. Roy noted the date and the visual observation in his logbook. He did not tell Harlan Meese. He did not call Gerald back. Then came August 28, 1972, and the Soviet grain deal. The announcement landed across the plains without warning. The United States had sold 440 million bushels of wheat and corn to the Soviet Union, a deal negotiated in private and revealed only when the ships were loading in Gulf ports. Wheat prices, which had sat below $1.80 a bushel for 3 years, jumped to $2.60 within a week, and touched $4 by October. Farmers who had planted full certified wheat loads were harvesting into a market none of them had anticipated. Roy watched it. His 62 acres of hybrid had yielded 19 bushels per acre, still below potential, and his 248 acres of certified wheat had yielded 23 bushels into a market that paid $3.80 at the elevator. He paid down $4,100 on the Garden City Federal note and wrote on the last page of his yellow legal pad that the Soviet deal was a one-time event and that the plains had not received adequate subsoil recharge in 2 winters. What was coming was a drought year and possibly 2. He increased his hybrid seed production for 1973. He planted 160 acres of cold stratified hybrid that spring, holding 150 acres of certified wheat on his more reliable south ground. He said nothing about this to anyone. By the winter of 1973 to 74, the subsoil moisture across the western Kansas plains had dropped to levels not recorded since 1956. The Extension Service issued advisories recommending farmers reduce planted acreage and conserve inputs. Roy read the advisory at the feed store counter, folded it in thirds, and put it in his jacket pocket. Spring of 1974 came in cold and then abruptly hot, with a dry wind from the southwest that started in April and did not stop. Roy checked his subsoil moisture probe on April 12th, 28 inches, barely damp. On April 29th, 30 inches, dry above, faintly moist below. On the south certified fields, the wheat emerged thin and yellow-legged. On the hybrid acreage, the seedlings came up short but dark-stemmed, the root system already driving past the dry surface layer. On the north sandy quarter, 60 acres of his hybrid planting, the soil drained faster than any other section of the farm, and by mid-May, it was apparent that the stand was failing. The roots found nothing. 50 of the 60 acres went sparse, then bare. Roy walked those rows on the morning of May 18th, the sun already brutal at 7 a.m., the light flat and merciless, and he stood in the dead stand and looked at it for a long time. He did not swear. He did not kick the ground. He walked back to the farm wall, climbed up, and drove to the next field. He had 250 acres of hybrid still standing. The loan was due in October. He needed those 250 acres to yield. During that same spring, Roy's neighbor Darlene Pratt, a widow who farmed 120 acres one section to the east and said perhaps 40 words a month to anyone, had been watching Roy's fields from her truck for 2 years without comment. In May of 1974, she drove to the Garden City post office and mailed a packet of documents to a Dr. Patrice Wynn at the USDA Southern Plains Field Research Office in Wichita. The packet contained a copy of Dennis Croft's 1971 extension report dismissing Roy's hybrid trial, and a handwritten note describing what Darlene had observed in Roy's fields during the dry summers of 1972 and 1973. She had kept her own record of dates. She did not tell Roy she had done this. If you've made it this far, the subscribe button is right there. The harvest of 1974 began on the first Tuesday of September, with the temperature at 101 degrees, and the air carrying the fine grit that came when the topsoil dried to powder, and the wind lifted it. Roy started the John Deere 95 before 6 in the morning, its engine warming for 20 minutes, before he engaged the cylinder drum and moved into the first rows of his hybrid stand. The stand was not beautiful. It stood 26 to 29 inches tall, well below the county standard. The heads were compact. The straw was tough enough that the combine's cutter bar had to work harder than it would on standard wheat, and Roy dropped the cylinder speed twice during the first morning to prevent choking. But the heads were full. He ran the combine through the morning and into the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, he stopped at the field end, climbed down, and checked the grain tank. He ran his hand through the grain and let it fall through his fingers. The kernels were dense and hard, the way wheat kernels are in a dry year when the plant concentrates everything it has into reproduction before it dies. He finished the 250-acre hybrid stand over 4 days. On the evening of the 4th day, he drove to the Garden City elevator and watched the weight tickets come off the scale. The 250-acre stand had yielded 31 bushels per acre. The county average for 1974, certified by the Kansas Crop Reporting Service in their October bulletin, was 4 bushels per acre, the lowest recorded figure since 1936. Roy drove home in the dark. He pulled into the farmyard, shut off the truck, and sat for a moment. The yard light over the equipment barn threw a yellow circle across the gravel. He could hear the farmel's cooling engine clicking as it contracted in the night air. He walked across the road to Darlene Pratt's fence line. She was sitting on her porch in the dark, the way she sometimes did in the evenings. He said, "Came in at 31. She was quiet for a moment. The crickets ran in the dark pasture behind her house. She said, "Your father would have written this down." Roy said, "He did." He walked back home. The next morning he drove to Garden City Federal Savings and made a payment of $14,200 against the note. The loan officer, a man named Clark Buser, who had worked that branch since 1961, looked at the check for a moment before he stamped it. He did not ask where the money came from. He stamped it "paid in full" and slid the receipt across the counter. Roy had $6,800 remaining in his account after the payment. The word moved through the county the way such things move. Not through newspapers, not through the extension's monthly bulletin, but through the specific channel of people who had watched the sky and the fields all summer and needed to account for what they had seen. A grain elevator worker told a neighbor. The neighbor called his brother-in-law. By the 3rd week of September, the number 31 had been said in 4 different conversations at Mises' feed store without Roy being present for any of them. Harlan Meese heard it on a Friday morning. He said to the man who told him, "That's not possible. Nobody in this county got 31. The extension is reporting a county average of 4. The man said, "Roy did." Harlan drove out to Roy's farm on a Saturday afternoon. Roy was greasing the combine's auger bearings in the equipment shed, the air inside smelling of gear oil and wheat dust, and the particular dry heat of a Kansas September. Harlan walked through the open shed door and stopped. He said, "I want to see the field." Roy set down the grease gun and walked Harlan out to the harvested hybrid acreage. The stubble stood in tight rows at 7-inch spacing, cut clean, the ground between the rows still showing the characteristic pale dryness of a year that had taken everything it could. Harlan walked into the rows and bent down and picked up a handful of stubble. He turned it in his fingers. He stood there for a full minute without speaking. Then he said, "I was wrong about you, Roy." Roy said, "I know." He turned and walked back toward the shed. The following week, a letter arrived at the KSU Cooperative Extension Regional Office in Garden City, sent by Dr. Patrice Wynn of the USDA Southern Plains Field Research Office in Wichita. The letter documented Dr. Wynn's receipt of Darlene Pratt's 1974 observation report and Roy's 1974 yield data, cross-referenced against the 1971 extension report dismissing Roy's hybrid trial. The letter requested a formal explanation for the basis of the 1971 dismissal, in writing within 60 days. It was copied to the USDA Regional Administrator in Salina and to the KSU College of Agriculture's Department Chair. The Extension Office assigned the response to Dennis Croft. In the spring of 1975, Darlene Pratt knocked on Roy's kitchen door and asked for 400 pounds of hybrid seed at cost. Roy sold it to her at $0.12 per pound. She planted 60 acres. Two brothers named Ted and Calvin Pruitt, who farmed jointly, came in March and bought seed for 830 acres between them. Roy maintained 150 acres of certified wheat alongside his own hybrid planting. He was not a man who eliminated his fallback before the replacement was proven at scale. The summer of 1976 ran dry again, not as severe as 1974, but a season that pressed the county's certified varieties hard enough that the elevator records showed a county average of 11 bushels per acre. Darlene's 60 acres came in at 23 bushels per acre. The Pruitt brothers' 830 combined acres averaged 24 bushels. They sold into a market that was not the Soviet deal spike of 1972, but was still $3.10 per bushel at the elevator, and the numbers were visible to anyone who pulled the scale tickets. In the spring of 1977, a dryland farming co-op operating out of Scott County, 40 miles north of Garden City, contacted Roy through a letter. They had heard the yield figures from the Pruitt brothers. They asked about the cold stratification process specifically. Someone had described it to them, and they wanted to understand it before they attempted it. Roy wrote them a 3-page letter describing the process in the exact terms his father had used, with his own additions from 6 years of refinement. He included the temperature range, the tray arrangement, the duration, and the testing method for germination rate before planting. He asked nothing in return. Also in 1977, a reporter from the Garden City Telegram called Roy's house and asked for an interview about the 1974 harvest. Roy said, "I'd rather not." The reporter called back twice. Roy did not answer the second or third call. In March of 1978, KSU Extension published an internal bulletin titled Adaptive Root Architecture in Dryland Small Grain Production, Field Observations from Western Kansas, 1974-1977. The bulletin described a cold stratification method for enhancing seminal root development in wheat-sorghum crosses, documented the yield advantages observed across multiple Finney and Scott County farms during dry seasons, and formally revised the extension's 1971 guidance discouraging uncertified hybrid trials. The bulletin did not name Roy Callahan. It credited the original field observations to Dr. Patrice Wynn and the USDA Southern Plains office. Roy read the bulletin at the feed store counter. He read it once, folded it along its original crease, and put it in his jacket pocket. That evening, he placed it inside his father's oilcloth notebook. Between the 1936 entry about the accidental cross and the 1940 entry refining the cold treatment duration. More stories like this one are already in the queue. By 1987, Roy Callahan was 74 years old. He had reduced his planted acreage to 240 acres. The North Sandy Quarter had been wrested into native grass for 3 years as his knees made the walking harder. And he ran the farm with a part-time hired hand named Vernon, who drove the combine during harvest and did the heavy lifting Roy no longer attempted. The 1958 Farmall 560 still sat in the equipment shed, red paint chalked to a dull brick in the sunlight that came through the shed's south window. Diesel engine rebuilt once in 1979, and running without complaint since. His granddaughter Claire arrived in June, 19 years old, home from her first year at Kansas State, where she was studying agronomy on a state scholarship. She had grown up helping during harvests, and knew the farm's rhythms well enough to be useful, but she had not yet been walked through the logic of it, the reasoning underneath the practice. Roy took her through the north field one morning in early July, when the hybrid stand was at its full height, the dew still on the lower leaves, and the air at 68 degrees and quiet. He walked her down 2 rows, pointing out the canopy closure, the low leaf angle, the stem thickness. He showed her the difference between the hybrid rows and the 2 rows of certified wheat he maintained as a reference check each year along the south fence. Claire asked him why he still ran the cold stratification process, since she had learned at KSU that newer winter wheat varieties had been bred with improved root architecture that didn't require it. Roy stopped walking. He looked at the ground. He said, "Because the drought doesn't care what's new." He walked her to the equipment shed and showed her the 1941 seed drill. The wooden seed box refinished for the second time in 1983. The brass fittings original. The disc openers resharpened twice in 46 years. He opened the flat wooden box on the workbench and showed her the maintenance logbook, entries running from 1941 to the present, in 3 different sets of handwriting. Walter's, Roy's, and then Vernon's for the past 2 seasons. The logbook also listed every cold stratification run since 1969, with dates, temperatures, tray counts, and germination test results. He handed her his father's first oilcloth notebook, the one from 1921 to 1936, and told her to sit at the workbench and copy the root depth measurement entries from the 1936 season into the new composition notebook he had bought at the drugstore in Garden City. He watched her uncap the pen and begin. She worked carefully. Her handwriting ran neat and even beneath Walter's cramped pencil script. The measurements transferred with their original dates, and observations intact. Nothing simplified, nothing omitted. In October of 1987, the harvest was complete. Roy walked the north field in the afternoon. The sky that particular high plains blue that came after the harvest dust settled, and before the first northern cold front, the stubble pale gold in the low angle light. The rows were cut at 7-inch spacing, the same spacing his father's drill had set into this ground since 1941. The spacing was visible even in the harvested stubble. 46 years of the same interval, season after season, the land accepting it so completely that the rows looked less like something imposed and more like something the field had always contained. He stood there for a while. He was not thinking about the yield. He was not thinking about the loan he had paid in 1974, or the KSU bulletin that had corrected itself 4 years later, or the 3 counties that now ran some version of the cold stratification process before planting. He was looking at the stubble rows the way his father had described looking at the 1936 survivor plant, not as proof of a theory, but as a fact that had required patience to see. That evening, in the kitchen, Claire sat at the table with the new notebook open beside her grandfather's old one. She had added her own observations from the July walkthrough, the canopy angle, the stem measurement, the subsoil moisture readings Roy had let her take with the probe that morning. The entries from 1936 and the entries from 1987 occupied facing pages, Walter's pencil, and Claire's ink, the measurements separated by 51 years and nearly identical. The knowledge had survived because one man had written it down carefully, and because his son had read it carefully, and because the drought had come back, as it always came back, and found the knowledge still in use. What the extension had dismissed in 1971 had not been an experiment. It had been a record. Records do not require institutional approval to remain true. They require only that someone maintains them precisely enough that the next person can read them without having to start over. The stubble rows in the October field held the interval his father had set. They would hold it next year. The notebook said so. Subscribe if you want to see what gets remembered.